Hello, welcome to Stats to Data, Matching Statistical Tests to Datasets. This is a Statistics Special Topics Talk, number 21. I am Dr. Mark Williamson for Transcend, that's Translational Science Engaging North Dakota. Brilliant, let's get started. The purpose of this module. The goal, as it were, is to match data to the appropriate statistical test. Often, researchers who may not have a lot of background in statistics know that they're going to do statistical analyses, but it might be hard to figure out where to start. So we're going to have several ways of doing that through several flowcharts as well as looking at images. So to lay the groundwork, I'll cover some basic things. I'll talk about a decision tree for a statistical test that I kind of initially did and then I expanded upon for this training module. Talk about what I call the four quadrants that help sort of quickly break down four main types of analyses, and then you can go from there onto the specific test. I'll show you the list of all the tests I'll consider for this module, this training module, and then go over various data types and descriptions so we're all on the same page when it comes to talking about our data. Now, for the actual matching data to statistical test, I have a variety of flowcharts. I have what I call the type A flowchart, very detailed. Type B, looser, more informal, to get the answer more quickly or get into the ballpark more quickly. Then I have a figure galley, so if you kind of want to start with the results or what the results should look like and then work backwards towards the test. And then finally, what I call the GLMM or the generalized linear mixed model flowchart, because really a lot of tests can be flexibly captured using the generalized linear mixed model. All right, with that, let's turn to the decision tree. Back in 2021, I made this a short video and I made what I call the statistical test decision tree, which had quite a few of the standard tests, but to really dig into how to distinguish each branch, you need to watch the video, and this is a little bit outdated, so I thought I'd update and have a little more comprehensive decision tree through various flowcharts and mix it up with different types of flowcharts to help get at the answer in different ways. So that's kind of the impetus. Now let's talk about the four quadrants, which is sort of the four basic kind of types of tests. And that's with the flowcharts really start by answering kind of four different questions, and then depending on yes or no of the questions, you'll get into the different quadrants. So what do I mean by the quadrants? So the first one is what do I call group averages. That's something like a t-test or a ANOVA. Whereas if you're looking at, it was hard to get the right term for it, but more or less a linear relationship where like one numerical variable and one or more others, you're doing something like regression. Now on sort of the count data or like the categorical only data, that's another quadrant. That's like frequency analysis, proportion tests, things like that, where you don't actually have things like means or you're not testing one numerical against another. You're testing sort of bins. You're testing cells with counts. And then finally, kind of sort of the grab all, the special types. That's like survival analysis, structural equation modeling, more advanced models. It's sort of like if we were talking about eukaryotes, there'd be plants, there'd be fungi, there'd be animals, and then protists are sort of the grab bag of everything else, even if they're not particularly closely related. That's sort of what the special types are here. All right, so that's the four quadrants. Now let's get into all the tests that I will be looking at today. So under the group averages, there are all the t-tests and their non-parametric equivalents. There's also a ANOVA, both simple ANOVA or sort of more complicated ANOVA, as well as non-parametric options. Under linear relationship, there's anything anywhere from correlation to simple linear regression and all forms of regression, more complicated ones, and also things like the Spearman rank order regression, which is the non-parametric equivalent. Under categorical, we have things like proportion test, Fisher's test, McNamir's test, and a couple different chi-square tests. And under special types, broadly speaking, we have things like ANCOVA, linear mixed models, also known as hierarchical multi-level models, and then the generalized linear mixed model, the most flexible. We have more time data, survival and analysis and time series analysis, and analyses that have multiple Y variables, like MANOVA, MANCOVA, or SCM, structural equation models. This isn't every single statistical test you could possibly ever do, but I think it captures most, if not all, statistical tests that a typical researcher will use in his or her lifetime. There's definitely more bespoke, more complicated, special purpose tests out there, and sometimes they're harder to fit in these quadrants. So if you run into those tests, certainly reach out to a statistician to deal with here. But this should cover pretty much all the tests that you should need. All right, let's go into more of the instruction on data types. First of all, let's talk about variable types. Broadly speaking, there's two types of variables. There's categorical and numerical. Categorical, well, that's categories. It's also sometimes called factors. And they come in two additional flavors as well, ordinal and nominal. So categorical, these are not numbers, they're some sort of category. So if you think of demographics, maybe it's sex, male or female. Maybe it's race or ethnicity, black, white, Asian, etc. Maybe it's in a treatment, there's treatment control or treatment 1, treatment 2, and a control, something like that. Now, when distinguishing between ordinal and nominal, it's really this simple. Ordinal, they're categories, but they have some sort of intrinsic order. So examples I have here is, say, like metal categories. You have gold, silver, and bronze. Now, these are different categories, but you can tell that there's an order to it. Gold is better or higher than silver, which is higher than bronze. Whereas a nominal variable, there's different categories, but there's not really an ordering that is really clear or even relevant. Like, for example, apple varieties, or even apple colors. There isn't like necessarily a ranking in those, and so that's kind of how you would separate out categorical, ordinal, and nominal. Now, the other type of variable, numerical, these are numbers. They also fall into two subcategories, discrete versus continuous. So discrete, example would be like counts. Really, that's essentially what it is, count data, like the number of chicks. It's discrete, so it's only integer values. It could be 0, it could be 1, 2, 3, but it can't be partial. You can't have 3.5 chicks. You can have 3 chicks. And then continuous is numerical, but it's decimal. It can have any sort of decimal value. Height's a good example of that. You can have 7 meters, 7.1 meters, 7.01 meters, etc. Really, the fineness of a continuous variable really comes down to the measurement accuracy. And you can see there could be a fair amount of overlap between the two depending on your measurement. You can sometimes treat one like the other. Like, for example, age is a good example. Everyone has a very discrete age, but typically age is only counted on a more discrete metric, like you're 58, you're 72. So sometimes how finely you measure things will depend on how you really distinguish between the two. And the notable case I want to bring up here is the binary case. That's 0 and 1. You could think of that as numerical, but you can also think of it as categorical. It's like 0, 1, on, off, alive, dead, things like that. And so a binary is a pretty common case you'll see in data, and so that usually has something like logistic regression to specifically cover it. So I just want to bring up binary. I mean, there's other cases, but that's probably the most notable one. All right, continue with some data types. Let's talk about random and fixed effects, because when we talk about more advanced models, this comes into play. So when you get into the data types of numerical and categorical, numerical variables are almost always just fixed. It doesn't even really make sense to talk about random and fixed effects. really, when we're talking about a difference between random and fixed, we're talking about a categorical variable, which can be either fixed or random. And so the easiest way to think about what's the difference between the two, by default, it's going to be fixed. Only more nuanced will we get into random. But a fixed variable is essentially when you have a categorical variable where all relevant categories are included, and you typically are testing for that effect of that variable. A good example of this in, say, like a clinical setting is like treatment. You have 4 different treatments, maybe 3 different drugs and 1 control. All the relevant categories are included, and you actually care about treatment on, say, some sort of outcome. Whereas a random variable is not that. It is a subset of the total number of categories, and often a random subset. And you're typically don't care about testing for the effect, but controlling for it, because there's variability there. A relevant example here would be, say, hospital. Say you're doing a clinical trial at 4 different hospitals. You're not specifically wondering if there's differences across hospitals, but that there are differences across hospitals. There's, different hospitals will have different sort of variability associated with them. And you probably can't do all the hospitals in an area. Maybe you just have a subset. And so this helps control for that in your model if you have hospital as a random effect. And so we'll see in some of the more flexible models, having a random effect will matter. All right, let's talk quickly about distributions, because another big thing of what statistical tests you can use is really how the data is distributed. Because like a lot of the classical tests like t-test, ANOVA, simple linear regression, assume that your y variable comes under a normal, or sometimes known as Gaussian distribution, aka that is parametric. If it doesn't meet that assumption, you typically can't use that test. You either have to do something like transform your data to something like, say, a log normal distribution, or you need to use a non-parametric alternative. However, in more flexible models, like generalized linear models, you actually can select the distribution outside the normal. In fact, some of the more common sort of additional regression models like Poisson regression or logistic regression fundamentally don't assume a normal distribution. They assume something like a Poisson distribution with Poisson regression. And so these are some common distributions. There's other ones as well. But distribution often matters, especially with the y variable when it comes to selecting the appropriate test. And then I want to just talk a little bit about x and y variables. Typically, the y variable is sometimes known as the outcome, the dependent or response variable, and that's usually the thing that you care about the outcome, whereas the x variable is going to be something that you think is going to predict that, so it's sometimes known as the predictor variable, the independent variable, or the explanatory variable. Typically in test, you'll have one x variable and one y variable and one or more x variables, though there are some models that you can use multiple y variables as well. And a big distinguishing factor of what tests you use is often sort of the nature of the x variable, the nature and number of the x variable. And we'll see that come into play here as we move on to our flowcharts. With that, yes, let's get to our type A flowchart. Type A as in sort of like the type A personality, very detail-oriented, sort of perfectionist, want to have everything figured out, everything lined up. So this is a very large and as detailed flowchart as I can do here. Whereas the light gray are questions, and then there's yes or no or other answers from there, leading all the way then to the orange, which is going to be the test that you end up with. Now, there's a lot going on here, and so we're going to split this out. But if you notice, what we have here is actually the 4 questions that can help answer which of those 4 quadrants I talked about before you fall into. If you answer yes to the first one, you're going to compare group averages. If you answer yes to the second, no, then yes to the second one, you're going to have categorical only data. No, and then yes to the third one, you're going to be into regression. And then if you say no to the first 3 and then essentially get to the 4th special data types, you're in that special data section. So let's then start with the first one here. If you answer first question, yes, you're going to be going into the t-tests and ANOVAs. The top part is going to be the t-test, which will start here. So after the initial question, you're going to ask, well, what's the number of groups? If there's just a single group, you go to the next question, parametric. So parametric also, so is your data parametric? That is your y variable, does that follow a normal distribution? And typically how you answer that is you look at something like a histogram. It should be more or less a bell-shaped curve. There's some other tests like QQ plots, etc. And if it is parametric, you can use the one sample t-test. And really a one sample t-test, kind of showing this box plots here. Box plots usually show sort of the summary of your data. Is you're going to be a mean of one category against some sort of static mean. Maybe that's 0, maybe that's a constant other than 0, but that's really what a one sample t-test is. Now, if it's not normally distributed, your non-parametric alternative is going to be a one sample Wilcoxon test. So say your histogram is really skewed, you don't think you meet the normality assumptions of the one sample t-test, you can do the one sample Wilcoxon test. So it's one sample t-test. So if you answer 2 for the number of groups, before you get to the parametric, you actually have to ask another question: do you have paired data or not? So paired data is when one category is related to another. Like a famous example data set would be like measuring the hind and front legs of deer. So the hind legs of one deer and the front legs of another deer, like they're connected, they're not independent. This is typically seen in things like before and after treatment. So you'll some person you measure beforehand, you have some sort of intervention you measure after. I like to you can do 2 box plots to kind of view this, but I sometimes like spaghetti plots to show that they're related. And again, if you have this parametric, you can do a paired t-test. Though it is to note that if you actually just take the difference between one group and the other, because they're paired between the ID, you really just break it down into a one sample t-test against your constant being 0. So they're actually functionally equivalent, but just kind of depends on how you want to do it. Anyways, and again, if it's not parametric, you have a paired Wilcoxon test, which is analogous to a one sample Wilcoxon test if you take the difference between the 2 groups. And finally, if it's not paired, it's parametric, you have a 2 sample t-test. Again, comparing 2 different groups, treatment control, male, female. And these are independent of each other, unlike the paired. And if you don't meet the normality assumptions, you can do a Mann-Whitney test. That's sometimes called something else, but most typically it's called the Mann-Whitney test. You can always, if you're not sure, you can always say non-parametric alternative to whatever test you're thinking about. So the other arm of this group here is now ANOVA. That's when you have 3 or more groups in your categorical X variable. So that's a t-test is 1 or 2, ANOVA is more. And so really a t-test is sort of a restricted case of an ANOVA, really. And the next question you need to answer once you get into ANOVA territory is the number of categorical variables. Now this is a little confusing because I say number of groups, number of categorical variables. It's a little confusing. So when I say groups, I mean the different groups within one categorical variable. The number of categorical variables is like the number of variables like x1, x2. So you're looking at some sort of mortality outcomes. You might have like treatment, but then you might also have like sex or geographic area or something like that. Now, if it's just one categorical variable, then you can just ask a simple question, well, is it parametric or not? If it's parametric, it's going to be a one-way ANOVA, and so you're going to have something like, Y outcome and 3 or more categories. So for example, here I have 4. Now, if it's non-parametric, it's going to be the Kruskal-Wallis test. I'm going to stop showing like red alternative pictures because it's really at this point you get the point that you have to check for it's parametric or not, and then go from there. All right, so there's one-way ANOVA. Now, the next part of your, if you didn't answer one, if you had two or more, you can ask things about paired and parametric and categorical variables matter. We're kind of gonna jump ahead a little bit to the one that's most conceptually similar to one-way ANOVA. So if we just ignore pairing for now and just say, yeah, all categorical variables matter, and we'll explain that later. And we say, yes, we have two categorical variables, we have a two-way ANOVA. That's where you have two categorical variables, and then they have different groups within their variables. Now at this point, so there's an example here, so you maybe have status, no and yes, and category A, B, C, and D. And you notice once you get up to two-way ANOVA, two variables or more, this number of groups doesn't matter as much anymore. You just need to have two. So for example, that's why status has two here. Our category could have four. But you could also do a two-way ANOVA where you had like status being no and yes, and category being A and B. The number of groups only needs to be three or more if you just have a single categorical variable. You're always in ANOVA if you're looking at two or more categorical variables at once. And with that, if you said no, you can always do three-way ANOVA or four-way ANOVA, and really more generally, you could just say multi-way ANOVA. Though getting more and more groups means you're going to have more and more samples to actually test differences between those groups, and it gets much harder and harder to plot, so that becomes less and less helpful as a visual tool. But you can theoretically do as many categorical variables as sort of your data would allow for, mostly sample size. Okay, now we can backtrack a little bit and talk about these other situations. So let's go back up to paired data. So if we do say paired data, we can move on here. Just like there's paired t-tests, the logical extension to ANOVA is what's called repeated measures ANOVA. So the parametric version is called repeated measures ANOVA, where again, the different categories are not independent. So maybe it's same group across multiple different years, across multiple different treatments. You could also do, again, like I showed you with the paired t-test, a spaghetti plot to show this, to show how they're linked, or you can just do bar plots like I've shown here. And there's going to be some sort of linking repeated measurements across these three or more groups. The non-parametric alternative is the Friedman test. Then let's kind of finish out with this question here. All categorical variables matter. Remember what I talked about fixed and random effects. So really this is starting to get into random effects. So if you say no, so not all of your categorical variables matter, you're probably doing something more advanced like nested or blocked ANOVA. So if it's a nested variable, it's nested ANOVA. If not, it's blocked. Nested ANOVA, a little more bespoke, but typically is that there's variables that are nested in each other. Like example here is maybe you have a Y variable, you want to look at an outcome, and you have categories, you have different trees, and then you have leaves, and leaves are nested within trees. So like if there's an observation that's like leaf 1, tree 1, that's different from leaf 1, tree 2, because one is nested into the other. Another common example for this more advanced thing that is outside of nesting is what's called blocked ANOVA, where you have blocked variables, where like the block variable is actually a random variable, random effect. So maybe you're looking at a difference between categories, but then you sample different, like say maybe different areas. You have blocks, these are maybe transects in a field or something like that, or even hospital like we talked about before. And we know that there's going to be variation across block, and so that's really a random effect that you're trying to control for, whereas probably the category is something you care about. Like maybe these are the treatments and these are the control or something like that. All right, well that's ANOVA, that's the first part. So we can go back to our sort of big four questions. So if we say no to computing group averages and yes to computing categorical groups, we get into the categorical only. So the first question from there you can ask is it a proportion or count? Now that's a little bit misleading, because really for the most part counts can always be transformed into proportions, and and proportions often can be transferred back to counts. So those sometimes you only have proportions and not counts, but sometimes they're pretty interchangeable, but sometimes it's helpful to just split them out of how you might analyze them. So if it's a proportion, you answer P. You can just do a proportion test, and at this point, some of the imaging isn't. You're more looking at tables because this is sort of count data, categorical data. So a proportion test would be something like this, where maybe you're having a drug, and you're looking at adverse effects. And so you have 3 and for drug A, 15 for drug B, and then these are the ones for no. And then you can get sort of a proportion between the two groups, drug A and drug B, and you can test if those proportions are really different. If you're doing more counts, again, you can ask, well, what's the number of variables? If there's just one variable, typically what we call this a chi-square goodness of fit test, where you're taking the counts across a variable and might have 2, 3, 4 different groups in it, and you're gonna compare that to sort of what you expect. So you have an observed count across groups, and then you're going to test against expected. So that might be all equal, it might be a specific proportion. I think genotype, you think of Mendelian genetics, is a great example. So if you have these genotypes, you have big A, big A, big A, little a, little a, little a. Typically the ratio is 1 to 2 to 1, and so you can test, well, does that match that 1 to 2 to 1, or does it not? And so you can do a goodness of fit test to test that, and you can not just genotypes, any sort of data that falls in like that. Now, if you have 2 variables, another question you might want to ask is if it's paired. If it's paired, you have something that's called McNemar's test, which is often used to sort of test how effective like repeats are. So, or how specific a test is, etc. And so typically you'd have maybe test 1, the positive, whether it's positive or not, and whether there's negative or not, and then you do it again, you test it again and see how well that holds up, and then that test will tell you whether or not it was significantly the test, that between the 2 tests, the 2 repeats were coupled or not. Now, if it's not really paired, you can have a kind of a final question of it's more about your data, about how much data you have. If you have a cell counts of less than 5, you have a very specific test called the Fisher's exact test. If not, if you have enough data, you typically do the more general chi-square test of independence. And what this is really doing here is you have sort of 2 variables, and in some of these tests you can have more categories or more variables, but I'm kind of sticking with the simpler things you usually analyze. And so either of these, you're testing one categorical variable against another, see if they're independent or not. So you might say, well, you're doing these tests, and you have these hospitals, are those independent or not? And if there's enough data, you do test of independence. But if one of these cell counts, that is one of these cells, is less than 5, so say hospital A was 2 instead of 35, then you do a Fisher's exact test, which deals with smaller amounts of data. Okay, we're done with categorical, so we can move on. So again, if you say no, but then yes, looking for a linear relationship, you're in regression land. First question in regression land, you should ask, is the direction of the relationship matter? Yeah. If it doesn't, it's correlation. What I mean by directional relationship is do you think y is caused by X or something like that? If one variable causes the other or helps predict the other, or do you just want to see if they're correlated? And so it'll be if it's just correlation, it'd be like a numerical variable, another numerical variable, and you're not really trying to predict Y from X. And again, it's not about the strength of the correlation, is whether or not you care about the relationship, the direction relationship, not the strength. Because things can be highly correlated or not highly correlated, or highly significant in regression and not significant in regression. All right, so if the relation relationship matters. And you can ask another question is, do you have polynomial x variable terms? If yes, you have something called polynomial regression. So this is a little complicated to begin with. Typically, the simplest regression, or the simplest regression, is simple linear regression, but I thought we'd just cover this quick on the way here. So in regression, you have y, which is a numerical variable, as a function of x, which is another numerical variable for simple linear regression. But with x, you can actually add polynomial terms. So you can be like x plus x squared plus x cubed, and that will essentially add additional curves to it that might make sense and fit better and be relevant for some sort of data. And so that's what polynomial regression, it'll look like having curves. Again, if it's not parametric, there's all sorts of alternatives, but if you say yes, so it's normally distributed, the y variable is, you can ask questions about the x variable characteristics. And so the simplest one is if there's one numerical x variable, that's simple linear regression. Y plotted, with x, and you're going to see does, can x predict y, or is y a function of x? And so that's what that looks like. Now, if you have all numerical x variables and there's more than one, you have multiple linear regression. It's hard to plot that. You can do a 3D plot that's less informative, but if you have 3 or more, you can't all plot them in the same plot. Then you're really looking at tables when you're actually writing the regression. You can look at separate plots, but that becomes less informative of what you need to do. You just need to know multiple linear regression. Now, regression and ANOVA are really kind of the same thing. So actually, with regression, you can actually have multiple, y variables, and you can have numerical and categorical variables. If they're only categorical variables, we typically just call that ANOVA. And if it's only sort of numerical variables, we usually call it multiple linear regression. But if there's a mix, a good term is a general linear model, which is really a more flexible case of both ANOVA and regression, where regression or ANOVA are sort of specialized cases of the general linear model. So that's what you do here. And again, maybe you can make subplots, but you really can't plot everything all at once. Okay, that's sort of the parametric side of things. Let's go to the non-parametric. What if the y variable is not parametric? Then you can ask sort of like a question is like, well, is the y variable something very specific? Like, is it a binary variable like we've talked about before, or is it specifically account data? Now, if it's binary, you say yes, it's binary. You have something like logistic regression, where the y variable is like 0, 1, yes, no, alive, dead. And you can plot that by doing something like this, where all the y variables are going to be 0, so on the bottom here, or 1 on the top here, and then your x variable can be continuous. It can also be categorical, but for plotting sake, you really only can plot it when it's continuous. So I've shown you the continuous x variable version, and of course you can have multiple x variables, etc., just like you can have multiple linear regression. But anyways, in the simplest case, you have a y variable that's binary and an x variable that's continuous, and you can sort of fit a curve to this that's going to be a classical S shape, because it can't go above 1, because you can't have variables above, but it can't go below 0. And so this y variable this line is sort of the probability of being a 0 or 1 as x goes up. So at the very bottom here, it's almost 100% probability is going to be 0. Much up top here, very high probability of it being 1, and like somewhere in the middle here, the y variable can't be like 0.5, but so this is really telling us, if you come to like right here, that's going to be like a 50% probability of what it's going to be, 50% probably between 0 and 1. Okay, so that's logistic regression, pretty common. So common that we have a specific term for it called logistic regression. Now, if it's a count variable, so it's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., numerical integers, we can call that Poisson regression. And again, it's plotted, and this will have a slight curve. It's different from polynomial regression, but it'll have a slight curve because it's account data. It can go to 0, but it can't go below 0. So it's going to curve down, but it'll never quite it might touch the bottom of the y-axis at 0, but it won't go can't go below it. Where something like simple linear regression doesn't have that assumption, so it could theoretically, shoot below a 0, sort of extending out. Now, there's two ways to say no to this. If you say no, and that's not really applicable, you can do a non-parametric version, which is the Spearman rank order regression. But if you say no, but other, like you know that there's another distribution and you want to use that, you can use a more flexible model called a generalized linear model. So a general linear model can have any combination of y variables that are numerical and categorical, but it must be parametric. It must have a normal distribution. The generalized linear model is more flexible. You can fit different distributions for that y variable. And really, logistic regression and Poisson regression are special cases of a generalized linear model, where, say, the Poisson regression is a generalized linear model that fits a Poisson distribution for the y variable. All right, with that, if you answered no for first three, we can get to the fourth and final kind of group, the other, more special data types. And so, first question to ask here is, well, is it time data? If you say yes, then we need to specify, well, is it time to event data? That's also known as sort of survival models. So if you say yes, it's going to be something like survival analysis. If no, it's going to be time series analysis. So time series analysis is just generally, you have some sort of variable and you're measuring across time, pretty continuous time, where something like repeated measures ANOVA might be like 3 or 4 time chunks, where time series analysis is generally a lot of time points. And then survival analysis, which is typically about time to, the length of survival, but it's not always survival. The more general is saying time to event data. So maybe it's time to, maybe not death, but time to disease, time to failure, etc. And typically you can graph this with something like a Kaplan-Meier curves, where it's going to be sort of this boxy dropping off from 1 downward, always decreasing. And you can actually have smooth versions of this using different models, but the Kaplan-Meier is going to be this sort of straight, sort of stepwise. If you're not doing time data, maybe another question you kind of answer, because like this is sort of a grab bag, so you kind of have to ask big questions to try to figure out where you're going. Maybe you ask random effects. So if it is random effects, you can say, well, okay, if you're talking about random effects, are you talking about ANOVA extensions? Like you want to do ANOVA, but you don't have random effects. Sort of like how some of those ANOVA we already actually talked about was like nested and blocked ANOVA. But you don't think it's quite that, or that's you're thinking more broadly and you want to say yes, you're probably doing something called ANCOVA, where it's analysis of covariance rather than analysis of variance like ANOVA is. And that's where you can actually have one or more numerical covariates that you think matter, and you can include those in your model. Again, whether that covariance really a random effect, that's sort of not quite right, but as trying to broadly answer questions, I mean, it more or less fits with random-esque effects. So, I mean, that's a little bit of inconsistency or overgeneralization, but more broadly, that's kind of where that falls. Now, if you're not really thinking of it as being ANOVA as much as ANOVA, you can go on to say, well, whether it's parametric or not. And so if it is parametric, what you're probably dealing with is something like a linear mixed model. This is also known as a hierarchical or multi-level model. So if you think of a linear model, a general linear model, that's one where the y variable is parametric and your x variables are all fixed variables we care about. But sometimes your variables aren't, they are random. So they're ones you don't care about, but you know you need to control for that. And so that's where you can have that's where the mix goes in. It's a mix of random and fixed effects, whereas a linear model is just fixed effects. And so you can have a linear mixed model. Now, you can get even more flexible than that, because if it's not parametric, you can use what's called a generalized linear mixed model. And I'm not showing it here because, again, it's usually things where you're not really plotting, you're looking at tables. And so this is a really, really flexible model because you can fit any sort of distribution for the y variable, like we saw in the generalized linear model. You can also have a mix of random and fixed effects, just like the linear mixed model. So it's a generalized linear mixed model which can do a whole heck of a lot and can cover almost all the sort of standard regression, t-test, ANOVA, etc. And so that's the most flexible. Now, on the other side of things here, if there's no random effects, and so maybe the big question you're asking is, well, are there multiple y variables? If it's yes, and it's sort of an extensions of ANOVA or ANCOVA, you have things called MANOVA or MANCOVA. That's like multiple analysis of variance or multiple analysis of covariance, where it's really ANOVA or ANOVA or ANCOVA, but you can have multiple y variables. You can do all at the same time. Now, if it's more flexible than that, you're like, no, I'm thinking about multiple y variables in kind of bigger, more general framework. You're probably thinking about a structural equation model, where you have some sort of graph like this. You have different variables. Maybe you have multiple outcomes, etc. Multiple x variables. Maybe even multiple variables that are unmeasured that you're trying to sort of estimate. This is something where like factor analysis is related to structural equation modeling. I didn't include factor analysis in here just because it was hard to kind of fit it in, and there's some types of factor analysis which is just exploratory, where you're sort of building things up, and then there's confirmatory factor analysis. So I thought it was just a little bit outside the pale that I didn't include it here, but you can kind of almost fit this in with structural equation modeling if you're thinking about factor analysis. So that is our special side of things. All right, so that was a lot. And maybe that was too much detail, and maybe you just want to get a fast and loose vision of what you're generally going to do. This is where the type 2 or type B flowchart, kind of going with the flow, just get an approximation, will help you. So this is kind of what it looks like here. It's a lot simpler, but based a lot on what we've already covered. So still has the 4 big questions, but I've tried to make them a little more conversational. So first you can ask, do you want to compare averages between groups? Yes. Okay, great. How many groups? If it's just one group, it's going to be a t-test. If it's more than one group, you can say, well, is there going to be more than one variable? If it's not, okay, that's a one-way ANOVA. If it's but if it's yes, more than one variable, but it's not more complex than that, it's a 2 or 3 or 4-way ANOVA. And if it's more complex, okay, it's going to be some sort of fancy ANOVA. It's going to be repeated measures, RM ANOVA. It would be nested, blocked, etc. ANOVA. So that's the group averages. If that's not the case, you can ask, well, do you just have count or proportion data? And if yes, yeah, it's going to be some sort of categorical data analysis. Proportion, chi-squared, Fisher's test, etc. Not a big deal. We'll figure it out from there. If you said no to both, you might next ask, do you want to compare numerical variables to each other, aka regression? If yes, you can say, well, do you care about causality? Do you care if X is caused by Y or the other way around? If not, okay, it's correlation. Pretty straightforward. If you say yes, you can say, do you expect sort of a straight line between the Y and X variables? You're just trying to, have a scatter plot with like a nice straight line of some way. If yes, then you can say, well, how many X variables? How many explanatory variables? Independent variables? Well, if you say 1, well, that's just simple linear regression. If there's more than 1, well, you got multiple linear regression. No biggie there. Now, if you don't really expect a straight line between the Y and the X, you're going to have something more complicated. It's going to be a Poisson regression, logistic, maybe it's polynomial, maybe it's a generalized linear model. Finally, if you said no to these first 3, you can be left with the question, well, do you want something more complicated? Well, you've said no, oh, okay, just go away. But if you say yes, then you're going to go into the more complicated, the special data types. If it's time variable, okay, it's going to be time series analysis or survival analysis, one or the other, or something similar. If it's not a time variable, you can say, well, are there going to be multiple Y variables, multiple outcomes variables? If yes, it comes to something like MANOVA, MANCOVA, or structural equation modeling. If not, you're left with, well, it's going to be a more complex than typical regression. if you've gotten to this part. So it's going to be like a linear mixed model or a generalized linear mixed model. And you can flesh out the details from there. So type V flowchart, simpler, maybe less precise, but hopefully gets you to a general answer quicker. All right, next, what I have for you, if neither of those are a little bit too daunting or too abstract, I would call the figure gallery, where essentially what I do is, first of all, I sort of condense some of these tests into sort of more groups, more condensed, less groups that are more related to each other, and just look at those. But again, across the four quadrants. And then I show you sort of what the outcome, what the results would kind of look like, and then you can go from there. So for the group averages, so t-test and ANOVA, if you're interested in something like a one sample or a paired t-test, you're probably going to have a box plot, a single box plot for a single group, and there might be a line here, a line somewhere that you're comparing your constant to. If it's a two sample t-test, well, there's going to be two different groups. So you're going to have like summary statistics, a box plot across group A and B. If it's a one-way ANOVA, there's going to be three or more of those box plots. If it's a two-way ANOVA, there'll be two categories. There'll be you'll have groups on the x-axis, and then you'll be like colored and have a figure legend of your second, or third or fourth, whatever. Just two-way ANOVA, just your second categorical variable. If you have repeated measures ANOVAs, it could look very similar. It could look like your ANOVA, one or two-way ANOVA, or it could be something like a spaghetti plot like I talked about, where you have your different observations that are connected by lines across your time, but there's going to be probably some sort of time variable. And then finally, something like a blocked or nested ANOVA. It might look very much like some of these other ANOVAs, but it might be more digging more into the actual variables is probably what's going to tell you that. Maybe they call them blocks, or that hospitals are a random effect or something like that. And so that's kind of what the figures look like for t-test and ANOVA. Now on the regression side of things, so if you just have a scatter plot, maybe with a best fit line, that's going to be something like correlation or simple regression if that line is linear, a straight line. Now, if it's that classic S-shaped curve like I talked about, that's going to be logistic regression, where y variables can only be 0 or 1, where the x variables could be continuous. If it has a lot of curves, that's probably polynomial regression. If it's sort of a curved line, but it looks like it sort of curves and it's bounded by 0, but it's not bounded higher up, it's not S-shaped, but it's sort of like this curve that we'll get to, can go to 0 but never below 0. That's going to be like a Poisson regression, or maybe just a generalized linear model. Maybe you have another distribution like a negative binomial or beta or something that might have a bit of a curve as well. If you maybe have your x and y variables, you have like maybe multiple lines of multiple colors, multiple different categories, that might be something like ANCOVA, or it could also be a linear mixed model. Here's another example of it, and the lines may or may not be sort of straight. They should be straight, but they may or may not be parallel. They might all be parallel, or they might not be. That they might have different slopes, have different intercepts. It really kind of depends on how complex your model is, but it'll probably look something like that. For the categorical, again, you're usually dealing with like tables, but you can sometimes have figures, and I put together these sort of figures as maybe being helpful. So for like a proportion test, it's not going to be a box plot, because box plots are summaries of a bunch of numerical data across groups. It'd probably be a bar plot, with a single value, where the y variable would have to be like percentage or proportion, frequency, whatever, or even count. And so you might have two different groups, and you want to see if there's a difference between the proportion of those two. A chi-square goodness of fit test, it might have something like a stacked bar chart where you have like observed counts, across, so maybe your two different groups, red and blue, and then you're expected, so maybe it's equal or something like that. And where something like maybe a chi-square independent Fisher's test would be something like a tree map, where you have on one axis you have one group, and then the other axis you have the other group, and you have the count, so you can see if there's independence or not between the two groups. All right, and finally, for the more complicated things, for something like a generalized linear mixed model, or sort of those linear sort of hierarchical models, or mixed models, etc. You can't really have a single graph, or typically don't, but you might have a bunch of smaller graphs. Maybe you have your y variable, and you're looking at one x variable, or that's numerical, and a second x variable is numerical, and a couple that are categorical, etc. Time series analysis, you're going to have some sort of time series. Maybe you have one, maybe you have two, like shown here, and you're going to do some sort of analysis. Time series analysis is something I really do, but I mean, that's a pretty common data type, and there's a lot of methods for those. Now, survival analysis, again, as I mentioned, there's probably Kaplan-Meier plots, whether these curves are for a single group or multiple groups, and they're going to have that sort of stepwise. As time advances, they'll drop, and they never go up. And they might not always drop down to zero, but they'll always decrease. Manova, again, you can have some plots, but often you might more have like a diagram where you have different factors, or aka different categorical variables, and then maybe looking at the effect of like different number of y variables. And then we're a structural equation model, maybe some sort of a graph like this. Typically in these squares are observed variables, where circles are latent variables, and the arrows indicate directionality of like how things what variables affect each other. All right, with that, we will close with my final flowchart, the generalized linear mixed model flowchart. As I said, a generalized linear mixed model is really flexible. It really can encompass pretty much anything you would want to do when it comes to regression, t-tests, ANOVA, etc. And so, instead of having this, really complicated type A graph, you can actually just fill in everywhere where you could actually just use a generalized linear mixed model, where those ones being a special case of the generalized linear mixed model. If I turn those to be purple, you can see, wow, there's a whole lot of purple now and not nearly as much orange. And again, since a lot of these things end in generalized linear mixed model, we don't need such a big flowchart. We can actually simplify this quite a bit. And if we want to do that, we can simplify it down to this final GLMM flowchart. Again, we still have the four big questions for those four quadrants. If you're comparing group averages, you say yes. Well, guess what? That's all something that really can be done with a generalized linear mixed model. Sometimes with like the one sample t-test, you have to do a little bit of loop jumping, or like the pair t-test, but you can kind of fit it. Though sometimes those very simple tests, you can just do the t-test with whatever software you want to do, and you're fine. But in theory, it can be fit with a generalized linear mixed model. Now, if you're comparing categorical groups, so it's just proportion or count data, really at that point, that's not really a good fit. You just do what you would normally do from the type A chart, proportion, goodness of fit, etc. If you're looking for the linear relationship, guess what? Any sort of correlation or regression, you can just use a generalized linear mixed model. And then finally, even in special data types. Now, if it's time data, you want to use survival or time series analysis. If there's multiple y variables, you want to use the Manova, Mankova, or structural equation models. But if not, otherwise, you can fit things with a generalized linear mixed model. All right, well, thank you so much for joining me for this training module. This module is supported by Transcend, so please cite Transcend if you found this useful. And there should be links in the description if you actually want images of the different flowcharts, so you can print out or you can save and have. With that, again, I'm Mark Williamson. Thanks so much for joining me. Hopefully this was a beneficial stats to data module. Thanks.